Welcome to the morning roundup. Usually when we talk about like a civilization in decline,
Yeah.
there's this expectation of visible, sudden destruction.
Right. It's an incredibly cinematic idea.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
We want the meteors to fall, the buildings to collapse, the barbarian hordes breaching the city gates, and someone just points and says, well, there it goes.
It is, I mean, it's a comforting fantasy, really. We want the end of things to be binary and loud.
Yeah.
It gives us a sense of psychological control to categorize disasters so neatly, right? To look at history as a series of clear-cut events with a definitive start and end point.
But when you actually step into the real world, like modern geopolitics, deep internet culture, the state of our physical infrastructure, that movie screen goes completely blank.
Totally.
We aren't watching a sudden implosion. It feels less like an explosion and, I don't know, much more like an autoimmune disease.
That's a great way to put it.
Like, the structures are technically still standing, but the internal mechanisms that give them purpose, resilience, vitality, they're just slowly degrading. We're looking at a civilizational landscape that is just incredibly murky.
It's a profound unraveling of the social and physical shock absorbers that we have spent centuries building. And what was most unsettling is that this unraveling is happening quietly.
Right.
It's beneath the surface of everyday life, kind of masked by this thick veneer of technological convenience.
And that's the exact territory we are mapping out for you today on this deep dive. Looking at the stack of sources for today, the sheer variety is, it's almost dizzying at first glance.
It really is.
We are spanning global economic warnings, geopolitical unrest, the sudden behavioral pivots of massive internet influencers, the cognitive architecture of artificial intelligence, and then wrapping all the way back to the ancient theology of the imagination.
Quite the stack.
Right. But our mission today is to thread these seemingly disparate sources together, because once you lay them all out on the table, a massive underlying theme emerges.
And that theme is that the modern world is experiencing a profound crisis of meaning.
Exactly. We are watching a collapse of structural and social stability, accompanied by this desperate and often totally misdirected thirst for re-enchantment.
What's fascinating here is the dual nature of this collapse. Modernity has effectively amputated our intuition and our group solidarity, leaving the individual incredibly fragile.
Yeah.
Now, both the individual and the broader civilization are desperately trying to cope with that fragility. Some are reaching for incredibly destructive, insulating mechanisms, while others are recognizing the void and seeking genuine spiritual and cultural renewal.
We are going to examine all those coping mechanisms in detail today, but to set the table, we really need to look at the macro level first.
Definitely.
The physical and social infrastructures of the West are showing severe, undeniable signs of strain. And the starkest visual representation of this in today's sources comes from recent footage out of Paris.
Yeah, that footage was something else.
Commentators like Asmongold and Richard IV have been breaking down video of what was, supposed to be a standard sports celebration turning into absolute chaos.
This was following a Paris Saint-Germain Champions League victory, and what is typically a moment of civic pride just devolved incredibly rapidly into organized destruction.
We are talking about 780 arrests in a single night.
Wow.
Fires burning right near the base of the Eiffel Tower, cars overturned and destroyed, municipal infrastructure smashed. The footage makes central Paris look like an active combat zone.
It really does.
And what the sources highlight here isn't just the physical damage, right? It is the deep cultural disconnect driving it.
Right.
Now, to be clear, we're just reporting what's in the sources here. But the commentators make the argument that this level of casual, widespread violence is inherently linked to failures of diversity and integration.
Specifically, they point to mass immigration from the global south colliding with a host culture that no longer knows how to assert its own boundaries.
Right. The underlying argument being presented by these cultural critics is that the West is suffering from a paralyzing post-World War II guilt.
Exactly. This guilt acts as a cognitive block, preventing the host civilization from defending its own cultural baseline.
It's like they're frozen.
Yeah. The riots, in this framework, aren't just an anomaly of sports hooliganism, they are a stress test. They reveal a society that has invited in populations that do not necessarily share its foundational values.
While the host society itself feels like too morally compromised or too terrified of historical shadows to enforce any standard of order or assimilation.
And the sources point out how predictable the institutional response to this has become. Whenever this happens, the immediate reaction from politicians is to blame socioeconomic factors.
Right. They point to the legacy of colonialism or a lack of funding for public spaces.
Right. The solution is always to build more state programs or drop more table tennis tables into the banlieues.
But the commentators in our sources argue that this purely materialistic view is a smokescreen.
The actual issue is that the native population has lost the psychological will to assert its own cultural preservation.
And this brings us to a historical framework that explains the mechanics of this exact kind of civilizational fatigue. I want to look at the source from Thinking West, which dives into the 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun.
Oh, Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah is arguably one of the most important works of sociology and history ever written.
It's brilliant.
It really is, precisely because he identified the cyclical, almost biological nature of empires. He introduced a concept called asabiya, which is loosely translated as group feeling or social solidarity.
But it is much deeper than just liking your neighbors, right?
Oh, much deeper. It's the invisible glue. It's the shared psychological architecture that makes a group of individuals willing to sacrifice their own immediate self-interest for the survival of the whole.
So it's the willingness to physically fight for your group, to protect the vulnerable among you, and to actually advocate for your collective future.
Exactly, and Ibn Khaldun maps out a very specific civilizational life cycle based on the waxing and waning of this asabiya.
Okay, break that down for us.
So he argues that all cultures begin in a nomadic or desert stage. In this environment, life is relentlessly harsh.
You're just trying to survive.
Right. You don't have the luxury of high walls, complex legal systems, or a professional standing army. Your survival depends entirely on the courage and loyalty of your tightly knit clan.
In that environment, extreme shared hardship forces extreme cooperation. If you act purely out of self-interest in the desert, the whole tribe dies. So the brain chemistry of the group actually aligns around mutual defense.
And that intense asabiya acts as a massive competitive advantage. These hardened, cohesive nomadic groups inevitably push outward, conquer softer populations, and build empires.
Which ushers in the second stage, right? Urbanization and sedentary life.
Yes. The conquering culture settles down. They build magnificent cities, establish complex economies, and generate massive material wealth.
Which is the paradox. The very goal of all that initial struggle and solidarity is to build a safe, prosperous society. But Ibn Khaldun is saying that the achievement of the goal is what triggers the decline.
It literally contains the seeds of its own destruction, because over a few generations, that prosperity fundamentally alters the psychology of the population.
Right. The shared hardship is gone. Comfort replaces struggle.
And people become highly individualized. They get obsessed with personal gain, luxury, status. They no longer feel the need to defend the group themselves.
They outsource it.
Exactly. They outsource their defense to mercenaries, or in our modern context, to massive impersonal state institutions. The toughness forged in the desert evaporates.
Comfort breeds apathy toward the common good.
And as the civilization expands, it naturally absorbs many different groups with their own competing asabiyas. This leads to rampant factionalism.
So the original group feeling dissolves into a myriad of self-interested subgroups.
And eventually, the civilization becomes so hollowed out that it falls to the next hungry, cohesive, nomadic group on its borders.
Okay, let's unpack this. So we essentially build a fortress so luxurious, so heavily padded, that the people inside forget how to lock the front door. Or worse, they just pay someone else a fraction of their wealth to guard the door, and that guard frankly has no deeply rooted spiritual reason to care if the fortress gets ransacked.
That's a perfect analogy.
But are we looking at an inevitable biological loop here? Is comfort an actual disease state for a civilization?
According to Ibn Khaldun, if left unchecked by conscious moral and spiritual effort, yes, it is an inevitable decay.
Wow.
The human nervous system is just not evolved to handle perpetual, effortless luxury. It requires friction to maintain its structural integrity. And we have incredibly stark modern data in your sources that maps perfectly onto this model of decadent decline.
Oh, you're talking about the 2024 Gallup poll.
Yes. It asked a remarkably simple, clarifying question across the globe. Just, if there were a war that involved your country, would you be willing to fight for your country?
The results of this poll are a perfect mathematical expression of what we were talking about. The contrast is jarring.
The nations exhibiting the highest willingness to fight are overwhelmingly located in the Middle East, West Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe.
Places like Armenia, Saudi Arabia, Azerbaijan, Pakistan.
Right. All of them show well over 80% of their populations expressing a willingness to physically defend their nation.
That's huge.
They have retained a high degree of that primal asabiya, their historical memory of struggle is fresh, and their social cohesion remains a matter of immediate survival.
And then you look at the West. We are sitting at the absolute bottom of this metric. Italy registered as 78%, explicitly unwilling to fight.
Unwilling.
The United States, a country historically defined by its patriotic self-image, sits at only 41% willing to fight.
It's staggering. Western Europe as an aggregate is displaying a massive, historically unprecedented deficit in civilizational solidarity.
Which perfectly mirrors Ibn Khaldun's sedentary late-stage empire. We possess unprecedented material wealth, technological supremacy, military hardware, but we have completely lost the internal narrative of why we should stay together as a group.
The physical body of the civilization is massive, but the psychological immune system has flatlined.
And this leads us to an incredibly dangerous convergence. Because it is not merely our social buffers that are depleted. Our physical and economic buffers are disappearing at the exact same historical moment.
Let's talk about the oil.
Yes, I want to look at the clear value tax source, detailing the current warnings surrounding the global oil supply.
This is where the philosophical decay meets hard physical reality. We are seeing independent, dire warnings from major institutional players: Exxon, Chevron, the International Energy Agency.
Neil Chapman, the senior vice president at ExxonMobil, has stated plainly that global oil inventories are falling to minimum threshold levels. The cushion is just gone.
Right.
He is warning that a disruption could cause oil to spike from its current level of around $90 a barrel to $160 a barrel in an incredibly short period.
And the CEO of Chevron has echoed this exact sentiment, pointing out that the shock absorbers in the global energy market have been steadily drawn down.
The system's capacity to absorb any geopolitical imbalance is drastically diminished.
And we have to explain the mechanics of this, because people hear $160 a barrel and they just think, oh, filling up my car is going to be annoying.
Right, it's so much bigger than that. Oil is the foundational energy currency of the modern world. It's not just gasoline, it's the diesel that powers every shipping cook, every cargo ship, every tractor harvesting food.
Exactly. It's the petrochemicals required for fertilizers, plastics, pharmaceuticals. If the base cost of energy nearly doubles overnight, the inflationary cascade through the entire supply chain would be catastrophic.
And the reason we are so vulnerable right now comes down to the U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the SPR.
The SPR was designed specifically as the ultimate physical buffer against this exact kind of geopolitical shock.
Right. And the timeline here is critical. It took 27 years, starting from 1982, to build that emergency stockpile up to its peak of 725 million barrels. It was a multi-generational project of savings and security.
But the sources highlight that this reserve has been rapidly drained, largely for short-term political expediency to artificially suppress domestic gas prices,
bringing the reserve all the way down to 365 million barrels.
We have halved our emergency savings in a fraction of the time it took to build them.
It's crazy.
And we're doing this at a time when the International Energy Agency is reporting that conflicts surrounding the Strait of Hormuz are causing a 14.4 million barrel per day shortfall compared to pre-war levels.
Over 20% of the world's total oil supply passes through that specific, highly contested maritime choke point.
It is the equivalent of draining your family's emergency savings account to pay for a vacation right as you watch a Category 5 hurricane form off the coast.
The synthesis of these two macro trends is chilling. The West is running out of its physical shock absorbers, its oil reserves and economic flexibility, at the exact same time that it has entirely depleted its social shock absorbers, its asabiya.
When the physical crisis inevitably hits, we do not have the social cohesion, the willingness to sacrifice for one another, to weather the storm together.
Which brings up a very practical dilemma for the individual living inside this system. When faced with the prospect of both social and economic instability, the natural human instinct is absolute self-preservation.
Fight or flight.
Right. This is highlighted in the Heresy Financial Source regarding market participation. A lot of people look at this dual collapse and their immediate reaction is to just pull all their money out of the system.
They want to liquidate, hold 75% in cash, and effectively hide under the mattress.
But the source makes a crucial point about the mechanics of modern economics. Acting purely out of fear is incredibly dangerous because a fiat system structurally punishes hoarding.
Yeah, if oil spikes and inflation skyrockets because governments are forced into massive money printing to cover the gaps, that cash under the mattress loses its purchasing power exponentially.
The overarching lesson is that the system forces participation. You cannot simply build an individual bunker and hide from the macroeconomic reality.
You have to learn how to navigate it intelligently, mitigating risk rather than attempting an impossible retreat.
But attempting that impossible retreat is exactly how millions of people are reacting, not just economically, but socially and relationally.
Oh, absolutely.
If civilizational asabiya is breaking down and people realize the larger group won't protect them, they turn to hyper-individualism. They try to insulate themselves through highly transactional behavior.
And nowhere is this more vividly displayed than in deep internet culture and the modern dating market.
Let's look at the based camp source. It details the sudden pivot of anti-marriage influencers. It is a perfect case study in this.
It really is a fascinating real-time sociological experiment. We are observing the behavioral patterns of individuals who have fully internalized the late-stage decadent phase of Ibn Khaldun's model, and they're applying it directly to human intimacy.
We are looking at massive cultural figures. TikTok personalities and podcasters like MJ Gray, Alex Cooper from Call Her Daddy, Wizard Liz, Danielle Walter.
These are women who built colossal platforms. We are talking millions of highly devoted, highly impressionable followers built entirely around a very specific militant brand.
And that brand was rooted in the absolute rejection of traditional commitment. They promoted a hyper-individualized, fiercely autonomous lifestyle, framing traditional marriage as like a structural trap designed to enslave women.
They explicitly preached that relationships should be viewed through a purely transactional, almost sociopathic lens.
The messaging was relentless. Men are the apex predator, therefore women must be ruthless extractors in response. Never go Dutch on a date. Demand that men fund a luxurious, soft life.
Right, use relationships to extract resources, but fiercely guard your autonomy and absolutely do not settle down. It was the total commodification of romance.
But the psychological reality is that this behavior is highly insulating and inherently defensive. It views the other person not as a partner in building a shared life like a micro-asabiya, but as an adversary to be outmaneuvered.
But the sheer hypocrisy of the movement has recently been exposed by the influencers themselves.
This is the massive plot twist the source breaks down. Right around the time these specific influencers hit age 30, or shortly after they secure massive financial wealth and cultural status, their behavior violently pivots.
Out of nowhere.
Yeah, out of nowhere, MJ Gray announces an engagement. Alex Cooper reveals a pregnancy and a marriage. Danielle Walter debuts a serious, committed boyfriend.
They rapidly and publicly abandon the very ideology of militant independence they sold to millions of young women.
Which forces us to examine the underlying mechanics of this phenomenon. Why construct this massive ideological edifice only to abandon it the moment it becomes inconvenient?
The evolutionary psychology analysis provided in the source suggests a deeply cynical strategy known as mate blocking.
Walk me through the mechanics of that, because it sounds incredibly Machiavellian.
It really does. It requires looking at the dating market as an economy of scarcity. In a society where high-value, highly committed, economically stable men are increasingly rare, competition among women for those partners is fierce. If a woman who is already successfully navigating the upper echelons of that dating market can simultaneously broadcast anti-marriage, transactional propaganda to millions of average women, she effectively removes a massive swath of her own competition from the board.
Oh, wow. By convincing millions of her peers that marriage is a trap and that they should instead adopt a highly aggressive, demanding posture that repels serious men, she thins out the herd.
Precisely. She convinces her followers to adopt a behavioral strategy that makes them unappealing for long-term commitment, all while she quietly secures that exact commitment for herself in the background.
That is wild.
Now, whether this is a conscious Machiavellian plot or an unconscious evolutionary drive for resource monopolization is up for debate, but the result is the same.
It is a profound betrayal of their audience, but it also reveals a tragic underlying truth. These influencers and the millions who follow them are operating out of deep generational pain.
They inherited a broken model.
Exactly. They looked at the marriages of the Boomer and Gen X generations, marriages often characterized by high divorce rates, quiet desperation, and instability, and they made a defensive calculation. They said, I refuse to be trapped in that.
So they swung the pendulum to the extreme opposite: hyperpromiscuity, guarded autonomy, and extracting financial value to compensate for the lack of emotional safety.
But human biology and psychology are stubborn things. The desire for deep, committed attachment is hardwired into our nervous system. The soft life of transactional dating is inherently hollow because it lacks the friction and shared sacrifice required to build actual meaning.
They preach autonomy, but the moment the biological reality of aging sets in, or the moment they encounter a lifeboat, a high-status partner willing to offer true security, they jump ship instantly.
Leaving their followers drowning in the toxic advice they use to build their empires.
They ultimately realize that the transactional life is a dead end. And this realization isn't just happening in the microcosm of internet influencers. Mainstream pop culture is beginning to reflect this massive shift, too.
Right, the sources use the HBO series Euphoria as a primary cultural barometer here.
Euphoria has basically served as the definitive aesthetic and moral mirror for Gen Z nihilism.
For 2 seasons, the show achieved massive success by explicitly glorifying the absolute breakdown of meaning. It showcased teenagers engaging in extreme drug use, sex work, OnlyFans culture, and sugar baby dynamics.
It was the visual embodiment of the disenchanted, hyper-individualized, transactional modern life.
But the sources note a jarring fundamental shift in the narrative trajectory for the upcoming 3rd season.
The creators have seemingly recognized that nihilism has a very short half-life. You can only deconstruct a society for so long before the characters and the audience are left sitting in the rubble, asking now what.
And the leaked plot details suggest that the main characters, who've spent years navigating this hypersexualized, drug-fueled underworld, are suddenly finding themselves utterly, crushingly miserable.
The novelty is worn off, and the void remains.
The narrative reportedly introduces characters who live deeply traditional religious lives, specifically a homeschooling family on a farm in Texas. And the protagonists, these hardened avatars of modern cynicism, look at this traditional family and realize something terrifying. Those people are actually happy.
They possess a quiet stability that the transactional world cannot offer. So the characters begin exploring faith, reading the Bible, and seeking an anchor outside of themselves.
When a show that practically invented the modern aesthetic of teenage nihilism pivots to exploring traditional theology, a massive cultural tectonic plate has shifted.
It is a collective, unconscious admission that throwing off all structural and moral bonds does not lead to liberation. It leads to an incredible, agonizing psychological void.
But here is the tragedy of our current moment. When human connection fails, when the dating market becomes a war zone of transactional extraction, and when civilizational solidarity collapses, where does the modern individual turn for comfort?
They don't immediately turn to each other. They turn to the machine.
This brings us to the ultimate technological coping mechanism, artificial intelligence. We are attempting to outsource our need for connection, meaning, and problem-solving to silicon.
We've touched on AI before, but the transfigured source, featuring the cognitive scientist John Vervaeke and the symbolic thinker Jonathan Pigou, dismantles the utopian narrative surrounding this technology with incredible precision.
The story we are constantly fed by Silicon Valley is that AI is an exponential, unstoppable force that is merely months away from becoming an artificial general intelligence.
An omniscient oracle that will solve disease, economics, and human suffering.
But the scientific consensus detailed in the source suggests a completely different reality. The architecture of large language models, or LLMs, has functionally plateaued.
We are not on a smooth, upward trajectory toward godlike intelligence. We are hitting the ceiling of what probabilistic text generation can actually achieve.
The economic indicators are already reflecting this. The source notes that up to 50% of planned massive data centers have been paused or canceled outright.
Trillions of dollars in speculative capital have been poured into this ecosystem, but it hasn't produced the promised economic utopia. It has produced highly advanced chatbots that are prone to hallucination.
But the most fascinating and frankly terrifying mechanical limitation they discuss is the concept of model collapse.
Model collapse is where the math of AI meets the reality of human cognition. To understand why AI is plateauing, you really have to understand how it learns.
Right.
LLMs are trained by scraping vast oceans of human-generated data from the internet. They learn the statistical probability of which word should follow the next based on the historical output of actual human minds.
They are essentially incredibly complex mirrors of human thought.
Exactly. But human thought possesses a mechanism that Vervaeke calls relevance realization. This is the core of human intelligence.
How does that work?
Well, in any given second, your brain is bombarded with millions of data points. The temperature of the room, the sound of traffic, the memory of what you had for breakfast, the complex emotional state of the person you're talking to. Your brain instantaneously filters out 99.9% of that data and zeroes in on what is relevant to your current goal.
So if someone throws a baseball at my head, my brain ignores the color of the stitching and calculates the trajectory so I can duck.
Yes, exactly. Relevance realization requires an organic, embodied history. It requires a physical nervous system that can experience pain, hunger, and mortality, because those constraints are what determine what is actually meaningful.
The AI doesn't have that.
AI does not possess a body. It does not possess mortality. Therefore, it has no inherent capacity for relevance realization. It only knows what humans previously found relevant based on the data we fed it.
And this is where the mechanism of model collapse kicks in. Because we are now using AI to generate massive amounts of synthetic text, articles, code, and images, and flooding the internet with it. So what happens when the next generation of AI models needs training data?
It scrapes the internet, but now it is ingesting the synthetic AI-generated data from the previous models. It is training on its own output.
Wow.
Mathematically, this causes the statistical distribution to flatten. It's like taking a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy. With each iteration, the sharp edges, the nuances, the bizarre but vital human anomalies in the data get smoothed out.
The model begins to amplify its own errors and loses its connection to organic reality. The AI literally degrades because it is cut off from the human engine of relevance. So we are treating this technology like an infallible crystal ball, asking it to write our essays, diagnose our illnesses, and even act as therapist, completely blind to the fact that the machine is slowly suffocating on its own exhaust.
And Vervaeke and Pigot draw a brilliant historical and mythological parallel here. They point out that we are essentially recreating the ancient myth of the golem.
The golem is a foundational story. It's a creature made of dead matter, usually clay, animated by a spell or a piece of paper placed in its mouth, designed entirely to serve its creator and perform manual labor.
But invariably, in every version of the myth, the golem lacks a soul, lacks an internal moral compass, and eventually grows too powerful, turning on its creator and destroying the very community it was built to protect.
Pigot also invokes the concepts of Moloch and Mammon. In antiquity, these weren't just spooky campfire stories. They were representations of complex, self-perpetuating systems that demanded human sacrifice in exchange for power.
And that is exactly how we are interacting with AI right now. AI offers the modern individual incredible, intoxicating short-term power.
The transactional nature is undeniable. You give the machine a prompt, and it gives you a finished product. You can generate a beautifully written email in 2 seconds. You can summarize a dense 500-page book without having to actually read it.
You can generate a stunning piece of art without spending 10 years mastering brushstrokes. The short-term gain in efficiency is massive.
But the hidden cost is long-term soul degradation. We are sacrificing our internal capacities on the altar of convenience. And this isn't a new warning. The source brings up a profound historical parallel from Plato's Phaedrus.
Yes, in the Phaedrus, Socrates recounts a myth about the Egyptian god Thoth, who invented written letters. Thoth presents his invention to the king, Thamus, boasting that writing will make the Egyptians wiser and improve their memories.
But the king rebukes him.
He says that writing will actually implant forgetfulness in their souls. They will cease to exercise their memories because they will rely on external marks. They will appear to be omniscient, having access to so much information, but internally they will be empty, lacking true wisdom, because wisdom requires the internal dialectical struggle of synthesizing information.
It is the exact same dynamic, just scaled up to an unimaginable degree. AI is the externalization of human memory and human synthesis on steroids. By outsourcing the difficult, frustrating work of reading, thinking, and creating, we are amputating our own internal strength.
We are building a godlike machine out of clay while simultaneously allowing our own minds to atrophy.
Which leaves us in a really precarious position. If the civilizational structures are failing, if hyper-individualism is a hollow trap, and if silicon machines are a dead end that degrades our cognitive capacity, what is the alternative?
How does a modern person find meaning and stability without simply retreating into historical cosplay?
We have to look fundamentally at how human beings are actually wired to perceive reality. And this is where the source from the Broken Rune provides a deeply diagnostic look at our philosophical blind spots.
Their core argument is that the West has suffered a devastating, self-inflicted amputation of its intuition.
To understand this, we have to look at the philosophical shifts of the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. For the vast majority of human history, across virtually every culture, people operated with the baseline assumption that they possessed an inherent sensitivity to the invisible architecture of the world.
They believed they could sense patterns, unseen forces, moral weights, and a transcendent order that permeated physical matter.
But post-Enlightenment, the West engaged in a massive overcorrection. In an attempt to rid ourselves of corrupt institutional religion and superstition, we adopted a strictly materialist Cartesian worldview.
We forcefully separated the mind from matter.
We decided as a civilization that if something cannot be empirically measured, weighed, dissected, or put under a microscope, it simply does not possess reality.
We flattened the universe. We decided that the cosmos was nothing more than dead matter in motion. And in doing so, we essentially killed the symbolic imagination. We relegated the concept of myth to mean nothing more than a lie, or a primitive scientific theory that early humans used because they didn't understand meteorology.
But the source argues beautifully that this is a total misunderstanding of how the human brain actually interfaces with the world. We do not navigate reality purely through mathematical logic.
You don't fall in love logically. You don't grieve logically.
The human nervous system processes life as a narrative. We organize chaos by assigning roles, heroes, villains, sacrifices, and meaningful encounters. Myth is not a lie. It is a highly compressed, coded system for articulating profound truths about human nature and the cosmos that basic, literal language is too clunky to capture.
The contrast the source draws with China is vital here. In the West, it is very common to label China as a purely atheist, hyper-secular materialist state, but that analysis entirely misses the underlying cultural reality.
China never experienced the total violent rupture of its mythic framework that the West did during the Enlightenment.
They managed to retain a continuous, unbroken mythic continuity. They still deeply integrate Confucian principles of ancestor reverence, which grounds the individual in a massive multi-generational chain of obligation.
They retain Taoist cosmology, viewing the world as an interplay of fundamental energies. And crucially, they still operate on a deep psychological level, with concepts like the mandate of heaven.
Right. The mandate of heaven is the deeply ingrained idea that the legitimacy of the earthly government is contingent upon the approval of a cosmic spiritual realm. If the rulers become corrupt or fail to care for the people, the cosmos itself will manifest displeasure through natural disasters or social upheaval, signaling that the mandate has been withdrawn.
That is not a secular worldview. It is a profoundly enchanted one, and it manifests practically in their culture. When Chinese media creates a blockbuster fantasy epic, they rarely have to invent a completely novel, artificial intellectual property like we do in the West.
They simply set the story in their own mythic past, 5,000 years ago, populated with their own historical dragons, martial artists, and sages.
They possess a civilizational imagination that binds them together. It provides them with an incredibly resilient, underlying asabiya that the West entirely lacks, because we took our myths, put them behind glass in a museum, and labeled them archaic nonsense.
But the diagnosis wasn't entirely ignored in the West. The source highlights a group of profound thinkers from the 19th and 20th centuries who saw this spiritual sickness spreading and attempted to counteract it.
They call them the last wizards of Europe, men who made a desperate, brilliant stand for the re-enchantment of the Western mind.
I find the breakdown of these figures absolutely fascinating because they approach the exact same problem from three different vectors.
First, you have Carl Jung, who recognized the death of myth, but instead of trying to revive it as literal history, he mapped mythology directly onto the human psyche.
Jung's breakthrough was the realization that these ancient stories, from the hero's journey to the flood myths, are not just childish fairy tales or random cultural artifacts. He proposed that they are the deep structural grammar of the unconscious mind.
He argued that just as the human body inherits physical organs like a liver or a heart, the human psyche inherits psychological organs, which he called archetypes.
He looked at something like medieval alchemy. To the modern rationalist mind, alchemy is just a bunch of pre-scientific fools trying to literally boil lead into gold. But Jung saw that it was actually a mythic image of inner psychological transmutation.
The alchemists were projecting the drama of their own psychological integration, the process of taking the base, chaotic elements of the ego and refining them into the gold of a unified, individuated self onto the chemical processes in their flasks. Jung managed to save myth by proving it was a biological and psychological reality.
They have J.R.R. Tolkien, who approached the problem not as a psychologist, but as a philologist and an artist. He recognized that England, unlike the Norse or the Greeks, lacked a unified, sweeping national mythology.
But more importantly, he looked at the mechanized, industrialized horrors of the 20th century, specifically his trauma in the trenches of World War I, and realized that modern man was suffocating under the weight of the machine.
So he didn't just write The Lord of the Rings as a fun bit of escapist entertainment. He explicitly designed Middle-earth to function as a re-enchantment machine.
He understood that you cannot argue a materialist out of their worldview using logic alone. You have to bypass the rational defenses and ignite their imagination.
He used the mechanism of the fairy story to inject moral seriousness, heroism, and a deep, implicit theology back into the mind of a society that thought it was far too smart and cynical to believe in magic. He showed that myth can convey profound moral truths that mere facts simply bounce off of.
And finally, you have Rudolf Steiner, who attempted to save the mythic worldview through spiritual science or anthroposophy.
Steiner's contribution is critical because he identified a dual trap. He vigorously warned against the deadening, soul-crushing effect of pure materialist atheism, but he simultaneously warned against the rigid, dead literalism that had infected so much of institutional religion.
This is a nuance that is so often missed. A dead materialist atheist and a rigid, fundamentalist literalist actually suffer from the exact same cognitive disease. They are both trapped on a flat, two-dimensional plane of perception.
Exactly. The materialist looks at a profound religious symbol or myth and says, this isn't empirically, historically true, therefore it is false and useless.
And the fundamentalist looks at the exact same symbol and says, this is only meaningful if it is empirically, literally true in a historical sense.
Both of them completely miss the third dimension, the deep, transcendent truth that the symbol is pointing toward. A metaphor isn't a lie. It's a vehicle for truth that transcends the literal.
It is entirely about recovering depth perception. We have to learn how to read the world again. And this connects perfectly to the Theology podcast source, which dives into the work of Samuel Taylor Coleridge.
Coleridge was fighting this exact same battle against the flattening of reality a century before Young or Tolkien.
Right. Coleridge was a central figure in the Romantic movement, and his primary intellectual adversary was the 17th century Newtonian worldview.
Isaac Newton, for all his scientific brilliance, inadvertently handed the West a metaphor that became a prison. The universe as a dead, wind-up clock.
The idea being that God, the great watchmaker, assembled the gears of the universe, wound it up tight, stepped back, and now the whole thing just ticks along mechanically, governed by blind mathematical laws.
Coleridge looked at the complexity of nature, the depth of human emotion, and the profound interconnectedness of reality, and rejected the clock metaphor entirely. He argued that the universe is not a dead machine. It is much more akin to a living poem.
And to understand a poem, you cannot just count the syllables or analyze the ink on the page. You have to engage with it using what he called the primary imagination.
Now, when a modern person hears the word imagination, they immediately think of daydreaming. They think of making up fictional things that don't exist. But Coleridge meant something completely different, didn't he?
Yes, fundamentally different. Coleridge defined the primary imagination not as the ability to invent falsehoods, but as the living, active power of human perception itself.
He viewed it as a repetition in the finite human mind of the eternal act of creation by God.
When you look at a majestic mountain range, or when you look deeply into the face of a human being and genuinely perceive their inherent dignity and meaning, you aren't projecting an illusion onto dead matter. You are actually participating in the ongoing divine act of making the world intelligible. You are reading the divine language that is written into the very fabric of reality.
And the anecdote they share about Coleridge's most famous poem, Kubla Khan, is the perfect, tragic illustration of how completely the modern, materialist world misunderstands this deeply enchanted worldview.
Coleridge writes this incredibly profound, haunting poem. It describes a sacred river, Alf, flowing from measureless caverns down to a sunless sea.
To anyone literate in biblical symbolism or ancient theology, the imagery is glaringly obvious. It is a masterpiece exploring the deep, unconscious sources of grace and the creative spirit. It references the rushing wind of Pentecost, the fountains of living water welling up from the deep.
But the way the poem was introduced to the public completely hijacked its meaning. When it was finally published years after it was written, Lord Byron essentially forced Coleridge to attach a scandalous, sensational backstory to it, simply to boost book sales.
He made Coleridge write a preface claiming that the poem was the result of an opium-induced fever dream that was tragically interrupted by a person on business from Porlock, causing the rest of the vision to be lost.
Print the legend, as they say. The tragedy is that this marketing gimmick worked too well. For generations, secular literary critics swallowed the literal bait. They taught Kubla Khan in universities as nothing more than a brilliant, drug-addled hallucination.
They entirely stripped it of its theological depth. They couldn't comprehend that Coleridge was using the imagery of the sacred river to talk about the shaping spirit of the imagination, a divine grace that operates far deeper than our conscious, logical, waking thoughts.
They filtered out the enchantment because their materialist worldview didn't possess the lens required to see it.
Which leaves us with the ultimate question of application. We have diagnosed the macro collapse of civilizational asabiya. We have examined the utter failure of modern hyper-individualized coping mechanisms like transactional dating and the AI golem.
And we have rediscovered the historical necessity of myth, imagination, and intuition. But how does the individual listener actually apply this? Recognizing the structural collapse is only half the battle. The other half is addressing the deep, internal spiritual thirst that is driving so much of this frantic behavior.
And that brings us to our final segment. We have to look at the theology of the internal void. The sources from Father John Hamadi and Father Moses deal explicitly with this unacknowledged thirst.
Father Hamadi points out a profound, almost invisible tragedy occurring in the modern West. People are dying of spiritual dehydration, but they have lost the vocabulary to even identify what they are thirsty for.
The analogy he uses is stark. When your physical body is thirsty, millions of years of evolution have programmed a highly specific physiological alarm. You feel parched, and you intuitively know that you need to find water.
But the spiritual architecture of the human being is more complex. When people feel a spiritual void, a gnawing sense of meaninglessness, anxiety, or disconnection, they rarely identify it as a spiritual problem.
Because our culture has trained us to view every problem through a materialist lens. So when that anxiety hits, people throw material solutions at it.
They think, if I just secure a higher paying job, if I upgrade my house, if I optimize my diet, or if I just vote for the right politician who promises to fix the macroeconomic indicators, this terrible internal emptiness will finally go away.
But it never does. You cannot solve a crisis of meaning with an influx of material resources. In fact, Ibn Khaldun's model shows us that an excess of material resources often accelerates the spiritual decay.
Father Honey notes that this deep, unmet need is exactly why we are seeing phenomena like the massive influx of young people. He cites figures of upwards of 100,000 recently seeking out highly traditional, rigorous faiths like the Orthodox Church.
They are looking at the transactional, hyper-convenient modern world. They are looking at the wealth, the screens, the AI, and the hookup culture, and they are collectively realizing that the entire edifice is hollow.
They recognize the gaping hole in their own lives, and they are actively seeking true, unfiltered light.
However, recognizing the thirst and finding the right well does not automatically solve the problem. Because even when people turn toward religion or deep spiritual practice, they inevitably bring their modern transactional programming with them.
And this is where Father Moses provides an incredibly sharp psychological breakdown, utilizing the teachings of the 18th century mystic Saint Seraphim of Sarov.
Saint Seraphim categorizes humanity into three distinct types of Christians, or rather three distinct psychological postures that human beings adopt when approaching the divine or seeking meaning.
The first category he identifies are the slaves.
These are the people whose entire spiritual life is dictated by fear. They only care about avoiding punishment. They show up to church twice a year. They punch their spiritual time card. They follow the baseline rules purely to secure fire insurance against hell.
There's no love, no transformation, just a terrified appeasement of an angry cosmic judge.
The second category, and this is undoubtedly where the vast majority of modern secularized individuals fall, even if they claim a religious affiliation, are the servants.
These are the vending machine Christians.
Precisely. The servant mentality is the ultimate expression of the transactional mindset. These individuals will do good deeds, they will pray, they will donate to charity, but they do it with the underlying absolute expectation of a direct material reward from God or the universe.
I put in 3 tokens of good behavior. Therefore, the universe owes me a promotion, a perfectly healthy family, and an existence free of friction. They treat the divine like a cosmic genie.
And the tragic flaw of the servant mindset is how brittle it is. Because the moment genuine suffering hits, The moment they get a terrifying medical diagnosis or the economy crashes or a relationship falls apart, they are filled with furious, righteous indignation.
They feel cheated because the vending machine didn't dispense the snack they felt they paid for. They lose their faith entirely because their faith was just a contract.
But the third category, the only one that leads to actual meaning and resilience, are the sons and daughters. These are the individuals who have moved beyond fear and beyond transactional extraction. They seek actual ontological union with the divine.
Saint Seraphim explicitly states that the true aim of the Christian life, and we can extrapolate this to the aim of any deeply meaningful human existence, is the acquisition of the Holy Spirit.
And this is where it gets incredibly challenging for the modern mind, because acquiring that depth, moving from a slave to a son, requires something our culture has spent $1 trillion trying to eradicate. It requires suffering.
It requires accepting the cross, voluntarily dying to your own ego, and leaning into the friction of existence rather than constantly trying to anesthetize yourself against it.
The modern impulse, driven by technology and wealth, is the absolute avoidance of suffering. We outsource our physical labor, we outsource our cognitive synthesis to AI, we avoid the emotional vulnerability of deep commitment by treating dating like a cynical transaction.
And the result of systematically removing all friction from human life is an epidemic of anxiety, crippling depression, and the total loss of the asabiya required to defend our civilization.
You know, it reminds me of the quote from St. Joseph the Hesychast, "Shed blood, gain the spirit." If you are constantly maneuvering, constantly manipulating the world and the people around you just to maintain your own comfort and avoid any emotional or physical discomfort, you are essentially building your own customized hell.
True, meaning the kind of meaning that builds unbreakable individuals and resilient civilizations demands that you bleed for something greater than your own convenience.
And practically speaking, how does a society full of hyper-individualized, traumatized people actually begin to do that? How do we apply this theology of friction to the massive, vitriolic cultural divisions we face every day?
The source, featuring Metropolitan Saba, addresses this directly, outlining the necessity of the middle path.
He argues that if we have any hope of healing the deep national and spiritual fractures, we have to relearn the excruciatingly difficult art of actually listening to one another.
It requires navigating between two highly seductive but ultimately destructive extremes.
Right. On one side, you have the extreme of false ecumenism. This is the modern relativistic urge to just water down all your core beliefs, abandon your boundaries, and compromise fundamental truths just to avoid conflict and get along.
It's the theological equivalent of having no immune system. But on the exact opposite side, you have the extreme of rigid fanaticism.
Fanaticism is the ultimate manifestation of the fearful ego. It is when you become so deeply entrenched in your own tribal identity, so defensive of your own correctness, that you refuse to even acknowledge the humanity of anyone outside your specific group.
You view the other entirely as a threat to be eradicated, refusing to even pray for mercy alongside them.
Metropolitan Saba says the virtue and the immense difficulty lies in the middle. You have to be strong enough in your own asabiya, your own convictions, to hold your ground without compromising the truth.
But you have to be humble enough to keep your heart open to the inherent dignity of the person standing across from you. You have to step out of the transactional mindset and view them not as a political obstacle to be crushed, but as a fellow human being navigating the exact same murky, terrifying waters of civilizational decline.
It is the ultimate test of the primary imagination. Can you look at your ideological enemy and still perceive the divine image within them?
Okay, let's bring all of these massive threads together. We have covered an incredible amount of territory today on this deep dive. The overarching reality we are facing is a period of intense civilizational burnout. The structural foundations are showing deep cracks.
Our physical reserves, the oil, the economic shock absorbers that keep the modern machine humming, are depleting rapidly.
And simultaneously, our social reserves, our asabiya, our biological and psychological willingness to sacrifice for one another, are at historic lows, eroded by decades of unprecedented comfort and outsourced responsibility.
And we have clearly seen that modernity's favored solutions to this crisis are actively making it worse. The retreat into hyper-individualism and transactional relationships leaves people profoundly isolated, desperate, and cynical.
The attempt to outsource our cognition to artificial intelligence offers an illusion of power, while quietly accelerating the degradation of our wisdom, our memory, and our cultural signal.
The way out of this trap is not going to be found in a new app, a more sophisticated language model, or a new government socioeconomic program. The way out requires a fundamental re-enchantment of how we view reality.
It requires reclaiming our amputated intuition, recognizing that the universe is not a dead machine, but a profoundly meaningful living poem. And it requires the brutal, beautiful internal work of moving from being terrified slaves of comfort to becoming sons and daughters capable of carrying the weight of true spiritual depth.
So as we promise, every time we explore these sources, we want to leave you with practical, actionable steps based on today's deep dive. How do you apply this?
Number 1, take absolute ownership of your defense. Stop relying on massive, crumbling institutions to guarantee your safety and meaning. You need to consciously rebuild your local esobia. Invest deeply, disproportionately in your immediate family, your local community, and your personal reputation.
Do the hard, unglamorous work of being the person your neighbors know they can rely on when the macroeconomic shock absorbers finally fail. Be the anchor in your local reality.
Number 2, conduct a ruthless audit of your technology use. Take a hard, honest look at how you are interacting with AI and digital distractions. If a tool is providing you with short-term convenience, but actively eroding your long-term capacity for memory, deep synthesis, or intuition, you must limit it.
You not outsource your relevance realization. Do the frustrating, difficult work of reading, thinking, and creating for yourself.
Number 3, evaluate your fundamental spiritual posture. Look critically at how you interact with the universe, with whatever conception of the divine you hold, and with the people around you. Are you operating like a slave, driven entirely by the fear of punishment or loss of status?
Are you acting like a servant, treating reality like a cosmic vending machine and throwing tantrums when you don't get the comfort you feel you purchased? Stop.
Make the conscious decision to embrace the friction. Accept the difficulty and the suffering required to acquire genuine depth, wisdom, and union with what truly matters. I really want you to think about this in the context of your own daily life.
Look critically at your own worldview. Have you been blindly accepting the cynical narrative that cultural boundaries, traditional commitment, and deep roots are just outdated traps designed to limit your freedom?
Have you allowed the modern, materialist priesthood to amputate your intuition and convince you that the world is dead? You have to decide this for yourself. We are just laying out the maps and drawing the connections.
We highly encourage you to go to the primary sources we discussed today. Don't take our word for it. Read the Muqaddimah by Ibn Khaldun. Struggle through Coleridge's poetry and look for the theology beneath the surface. Read the cognitive science warnings regarding AI. The material is out there for those willing to engage with it.
Take some time to reflect on where you are encountering these themes of disenchantment, fragility, and hyper-individualism in your own life. And more importantly, analyze how you are responding to them. Comment down below. Are you retreating, insulating yourself and hiding in a defensive posture, or are you actively doing the painful work of building your own esobia? Let us know. And of course, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share.
To close, I want to leave you with one final, lingering thought that builds on everything we've unpacked today regarding technology and the human soul. We discussed how artificial intelligence is entirely dependent on training data, creating a massive recursive feedback loop of our own collective consciousness. The LLMs are fundamentally a mirror.
Right.
If the digital world is truly becoming a high-definition reflection of the human soul, and we as a society are constantly feeding it data that is hyper-transactional, cynical, fearful, and totally disenchanted, what kind of God are we inadvertently building in the machine? The golem we are crafting will only possess the morality we supply it.
Wow.
If we do not do the agonizingly hard work of acquiring genuine organic wisdom right now, we won't just passively destroy ourselves as a civilization. We will leave behind a permanent digital monument to our own profound emptiness.
A digital monument to our own emptiness. That is a terrifying, clarifying image. Thank you for walking through this complex landscape with us today on the Morning Roundup. Keep questioning the narrative, keep building your community, and we will see you on the next deep dive.